Can we go ahead and shut them doors though? Because when people come in that back door, it gets so loud. I don't. It echoes up here. I don't know if it picks up on the
Getting
mic.
that one, I'll get this one.
All right. So we talked about purity. The Lord's coming with that one.
You know how strong I will win.
We talked about purity and pollutions. We covered all that. Now we're going into more of the ideal of a temple. It will be the first paper we cover. The first paper, the ideal temple, is of a book called Behind the Old Testaments. It's a multi-author writing. It's a bunch of white papers, really good. Scenes Behind the Old Testament is what it's called. They're really good. So each expert deals with a different from topography of the Middle East, climate change, not like modern day, but the changing of climate of the Middle East. If you go to Ur right now, you'll see that Ur is in a desert. At one time, Ur was on the banks of the Tigris River. So that's the shifting of climates. It covers an interesting fact about how they used to use cows more than sheep, but then the climate of the rain stopped coming around the middle of the Bronze Age, if I remember right. I'm going off of memory here. I like always going off of memory, but they started shifting. That's why the Middle East, the Levant area, the Israel area started shifting. The Canaanites started shifting towards things like sheep versus cows. They need less water and stuff like that. And so that's why it got really popular. Where the Egyptians still had cows because they had the Nile River and the Nile Delta and stuff like that. So, and it was taboo to be a shepherd in Egypt. They didn't like shepherds. They like cow herders. So it's just neat little. There's actually a back and forth where Joseph tells his father, "Don't tell them that you are a shepherd of goats and sheep, but tell them tell them that you do cows and stuff like that. You farm," or gave him a different trade. Even though Jacob doesn't listen to him, he tells him anyways. But so when they settled in Goshen, which is the most fertile land of Egypt, it was considered like taboo to have the sheep versus the cow, and of course the cow was used in worship and stuff like that as well in Egypt. So we're going to talk about ideal of the temple. Very important. We're going to talk about ziggurats first. We're going to do like a contrast. What is that where you compare and contrast? I don't know why I couldn't remember that. We're going to do a little bit of compare and contrast, and we're going to start with Sumer Akkadian religion, and then see how that affects or kind of similar to the temple worship. You'll find that most of these cultures, I'm sorry, David, I keep looking at you and I keep seeing the camera phone. You'll find that most of these cultures are very similar in sacred space and a lot of the ritual practices. You'll also see there's difference. The great thing about get here on time. Get here when you can, I guess.
Tick tock, tick tock.
His watch doesn't tell time either.
He hasn't looked at it. Well, let me get you some paperwork here, Roger. Should give you that staple.
Nice tie, Roger.
Oh, thank you. I'd actually forgotten, I already had another tie, a different shirt on, and I went, it's Memorial Day.
Well, thank you, Roger. So the first part is called the ideal of the temple. We're going to go over two paperworks, just so you know. This one, as I said, is out of the Scenes Behind the Old Testament, and this one is out of a book called Ancient Near Eastern Thoughts of the Old Testament. It's a actual college-level textbook. You learn when you start doing Near East studies by Dr. John Walton. I like Dr. John Walton. I think
You have a lot of brothers and sisters.
up on the Walton Mountain. No, I don't think so. I don't think he's kin to them Waltons.
Oh, okay.
Anyways, I like Dr. John Walton. He's a great. He writes a lot of great books, and not necessarily I believe everything he says, but he approaches Genesis a little different. He looks at it as a temple codex, which is also how I look at it. So he has influenced me a lot in my thought on that. I won't deny that. Versus looking at it as a book on beginnings, which you see Genesis is in the same genre as the rest of these style books, and they all have to do with explaining how worship begins through creation. So that's the goal, as he would argue, and I seem to lean that way as well. So we begin with the ideal of the temple, and we'll start from there.
I didn't think that.
The temple was central and fundamental component of the cosmos, the centerpiece of the function and identity of the community, of the principal mechanism for the interface between humans and the divine. As the God set enthroned in the temple, the order established through creation was maintained. You see this language in Genesis. This is actually my Genesis material, just so y'all know. I went through this a little bit with Roger and his wife and a few other people when we first started this. So I'm going to refer a lot to Genesis. But you see this in Genesis. What happens after God sees that creation is good? He rests. It was once you establish reign over something, a king would rest. God is resting, not in a sense he's doing nothing, but in a sense he reigns. Worship is towards him. So he's reigning and he's resting in that sense. So he's not active. He's still active. That's why Jesus says, my Father's always working. But Genesis said he rested because he's always working. He's resting in the sense of he's enthroned on the. So you're going to see this language a lot, just so you know. The forces threatening that order were held at bay, and the viability of the human community was maintained. The temples were a place of divine residence, not just a place where worship took place. Worship was only one part of a much larger enterprise, represented in the ideal a God had made his and her dwelling in the midst of the human community. As people engaged in various worship activity, they provided for the stability of their lives and the communities, and played their part in the functioning of the cosmos. Temples are the center of sacred space and delineate its zones. Space is made sacred because of the divine presence that inhabits it. This language that you see, this is language that you're going to see throughout the Old Testament. God's presence is in the temple, all right? The temple is somewhere at the top focus point. It's going to be near the kingship, the king's house. So this is similar throughout the Middle East. This is similar throughout ancient cultures. Where did I leave off? Okay. Temples are the center of sacred space that delineates its zones. Space is made sacred because of the divine presence that inhabits it, but the means is chosen by the deity beforehand as a place for his dwelling, with the instructions that is prepared for his presence. So, if you know Jewish culture, you know that Jacob was going to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Zion, where Jerusalem is. So that's the cultural reference. Now, do we know that? We don't really know that. That's just tradition. But that's believed where he was going. Oh yeah, Abraham's going to sacrifice Isaac. Did I say something else?
You said Jacob.
Jacob, I'm sorry. So poor Jacob. Threw him under the bus. Abraham was going to sacrifice Jacob. What? No, Jacob. Abraham. Isaac was. I don't know why I'm
You're getting old.
My bad. 2 hours of sleep.
He's got a headache.
So,
You want me to use some Tylenol?
no, I'm good. I promise you. So we have God establishing his presence there. You see that if you go back and look at 1 Kings, or is it 2 Kings, when Solomon finished the temple, God shows up, right? He shows up at the end of their thing, and then that's when he makes the pact with Solomon like he made with David. So you have that imagery within the temple. God also chose where he would put his tabernacle, because the cloud that was the witness, cloud of witness that moved with the children of Israel would stop. When it stopped, they would set up camp there. So God was always the one leading them where the tabernacle in the desert would go as well. And it winds up in a place during the time of David, in a place called Shiloh, right, which has something to do with peace. So once the temple is built, right, once the temple is built, zones were diminished, sacredness radiate out of the center where the divine presence is located. Each of the resulting zones has its own required levels of purity and its own sacred activities. I kind of already started setting y'all up for that. when I was talking about radiation. I used the same way of saying, you know, the closer you get to the center of Chernobyl, the more the radiation is still there, the more radiant it is. The further you go out from it, the less radiant. So the closer you get to God, the more sacred or the more cleanliness you need to have, the more holiness you need to be, because it's a consuming energy. If you approach God, that's why only the high priest can go into holies of holies. Because if you, a common person, went into holy holies, then you would be consumed. Right? So the cosmic role, because of the deities resident in the temple, it was the center of order in the cosmos. Different cultures had different ways of portraying the temples as a cosmic nexus. But because of this role, if the temple was not maintained and its God sustained, the cosmos would be in jeopardy and subject to collapse. In this way, the threat of the temple dissolution would be considered as having a similar impact to which we connect today with nuclear devastation, radical climate change, or worse, imaginable effects of pollution. In much conversation today, advocates greener living emphasizes how each person's commitment to the impact of something like recycling can join with the efforts of others to have a lasting positive impact on the planet and the ancient world. The same sort of logic was applied to the responsibility that each person, each clan, each city had in maintaining stability in the cosmos. By being actively involved in maintaining the temple, each one played their role in contributing and to continue in the cosmic stability. I want to say something about when I was in school, which a little less time than when Roger was in school. Climate change pushed down my throat to the point where if you didn't agree with the group, you were almost like a heretic. I remember they did what was that? Al Gore, the hockey stick. You gotta get the hockey stick or whatever. I don't remember now, but I remember the whole Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth, all that stuff.
It's a bunch of BS.
Yeah, just the fact that if you didn't agree, but you couldn't look at the data. That's what always cracked me up. You can't look at the data yourself. You have to trust the elites. And it reminded me of something I think it was C.S. Lewis once said. C.S. Lewis once said, in the future, the priests would not wear black robes, but they would wear white robes. And what he was saying that in the future, we would become so scientific that our priests would become the scientists. And we've experienced that during COVID. Did not Fauci become the high pope?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to get political. I'm just saying, didn't we experience that? I mean, where the elites could have dinner and you had to stay in your house. The elites could visit whoever they wanted to visit. I mean, that was a wake-up call if I ever was one. But you see that even in ancient times, right, where you have the high priest, you have these certain people who can enter in, you have this sacred space is happening, and it's not for the bad thing, it's for the safety of the people. But at the same time, this is where shame and honor would come into play. Each individual had their own responsibility. This is why when Lot is sitting at the gate of Sodom, he allows the people come into his door because that's hospitality. That brings honor to the house. So much so that he's willing to keep shame at his house. He's willing to give up his daughters because he knows that he can be the thing that brings down the whole house. Right? In other words, you see this with Korah, where Korah rebels against God. He takes the idols, he hides them, his whole family is consumed because they all instigated it. They were all involved in the crime. So they were all punished equally, where the ground opens up and it says they fall into Sheol. They fall into the underworld, alive. So we see that one act of somebody can bring shame into the whole camp. Joshua experiences. This is why Joshua starts losing battles, because of Korah. Right? God says there's uncleanliness in your camp. I can't be in your camp, therefore I can't bring safety. So they wanted to keep the balance. If you didn't have the balance, the gods would punish you in this sense, because we're talking more like a polytheistic gods. But even Yahweh does that. Garden Eden. The children, Adam and Eve, the priests of the garden, the priesthood of the garden has a meal with the serpent, the chaos creature. then Yahweh shows up, or Elohim, whichever. It starts off at Elohim and then does go to Yahweh by chapter 3. But Yahweh shows up and he boots them out of the garden. What he's doing, he's taking them out of sacred space to keep sacred space sacred. And then he's backing off because now they have contamination.
Sin.
Right, sin, yes. And then sin equals death. In the sense that sin equals death because sin separates you from the tree of life. There's no place in the Bible, in fact, rabbis have argued this for years, there's no place in the Bible that states that before Adam and Eve fallen that they were immortal. They just had access. They had access to God, access to the garden, access to the tree of life. So more than likely, they were enjoying a meal off of the tree of life daily with God, Elohim. And then when the serpent comes in, he gets them to eat off the tree of good and evil, right? Once they do that, now they're taken to they're in communion with the serpent, no longer in communion with Elohim himself. A meal was communion. To have a meal with somebody means you were in communion with that person. And so it shifts. They shift over to the wrong side, and then the serpent can't keep it because he's a chaos creature. The serpent's whole ideal, if you just look at Genesis from an ancient context, is how I'm reading right now, how I'm speaking of Genesis. The serpent is Satan, right? But here he's in the role of a chaos monster. He's bringing chaos into the camp. With chaos means Yahweh has to rise out of his throne. In other words, Yahweh is no longer the one sitting on the throne reigning over you. The one reigning over you now is the serpent. Now, does that make sense when you look at what Jesus said? The God of this world is Satan, because you went in communion with Satan. So in order to get you back, there has to be a process, a cultic process. Jesus has to die on the cross. The blood has to cleanse you. And once cleansing you, it pulls you back into the camp of God. And then we enjoy the body and the bread of Jesus Christ through the Eucharist. Now we're in communion back with God. You see how all that works? So, something to think about. So one individual could bring chaos. So this is where shame and honor comes in. Shame would get you excommunicated by your own tribe. And once you're outside your own tribe, that means you were outside of your gods. Once you were outside away from your gods, cut off from your gods, that means you're death, because there's not really much conversion going on. Because other tribes are going to deem you, well, if you're a traitor to your own tribe, we don't want you. That's going to be the way they look at it. So they would rather kill you and be done with you. Your blood would be on your own head. Once cut off from your own tribes, it is a death sentence. Because who do you trade with? Where do you get your food? Where you may be able to do it yourself. But in a world of the Middle East, especially during the Bronze Age, 2000 BC and later, it's a warring world. There's many change in power, many change in chaos. Different kings are ruling and rising all the time. There's not really a good trade route when there ain't no empire. If there is no empire, there's no trade route. Why? Because you are now subjected to the people who are coming in and raiding your camp. And that's why you have to move with a huge camp. That's why the wise men weren't 3 wise men traveling in the desert. There's probably a lot more than 3 wise men. There's probably a lot of soldiers, people to protect the wise men as well. Anyways, so the role in the divine-human relationship and the great symbiosis. Besides their cosmic role, temples served as the focal point of the divine-human relationship. The premise of this premise, thank you, I don't know why I said that. I know premise because we use a chemical called premise. The premise of this relationship in the ancient world can be understood within the framework of what we could call the great symbiosis. People in the ancient world believed that the gods had created humans in the afterthought. Now, this is an overview, just so you know this. That's the difference between Genesis and the Urner Elish or the Atrasis. I think I just butchered that first word. But there's 2 creation myths in the ancient Sumer Akkadian world. And both of them, the humans are afterthought. One, they're made from the blood of the defeated demigod. After Marduk defeats him, he takes his blood, he mixes it with mud, he makes humans. And both emphasis, humans are made as afterthought. And in their worldview, the human is only there to do gardens for the gods, to make beautiful jewelry for the gods, and then to worship the gods. So they're there mainly to work for the gods. And the king is semi-divine. So he's there as a representative or mediator. A lot of times a king or a high priest are your mediator. And they're working in a role where you bring them goods to represent, they represents the gods in a sense, where you bring them, they're semi-divine in some forms. Yahweh's not that. Human is the pinnacle of creation, so there are some difference here. I think, but in this sense, they're just talking about it in our general view. But that's not really what we're not really here to agree or disagree. I just want y'all to see the thought process here, more about thought and development. The cosmos had been made by the gods for the gods, but the gods were sufficiently like humans that they had needs. They had to sustain their own survival. Food was the most pressing need, and everyone knew the work that it took to provide sufficient food on a regular basis. Beyond agriculture, the activities of caring for herds, animals, were also part of the provision that was needed on an ongoing basis. The gods also needed drink. So the gods we're talking about here, we're referencing and comparing a little bit with, are the Akkadian gods and the Sumer gods. Most ancient gods needed food, and they were provided by the food by the humans. They could starve to death. They could be weakened. The Greeks and the Romans, mainly the Romans, don't really see offerings that way. And that's kind of where I'm trying to get y'all to look at, because I want to go into Leviticus a little bit, because I want y'all to see offerings, because I want y'all to understand how the Old Testament does offerings and how that compares to the New Testament. And so you understand better what Jesus is doing in his offering. I think I notice that's a big problem. So how do you fix that when it seems like people has like there's all these reasons why Jesus died, and some of these reasons are borderline heretical reasons. And my thought is like, well, I don't like telling anybody how to think or how to believe, but if you give you material, I think it will help you understand how all this develops, because I do believe that God is developing his relationship with us. He's adding more upon us as time goes on. So I give it more like a progressive revelation. Like God doesn't give the Israelites everything because they wouldn't bear everything. They would definitely turn back and went back in Egypt. It'd been too hard to change everything overnight. So he gives them little by little, gradual by gradual, until he can bring about the Messiah, until the Messiah can come, and then the Messiah can fix all our problems with his death, with our connection issue. We just have bad connection issues, right? Somebody ran over the Wi-Fi, broke the Wi-Fi box, so we're having connection issues. So anyways, so whether the purest water, the finest wine, the hearty beer, as gods they are not only desire the finest provisions, but also expected to partake of them in sumptuous feasts, accompanied by the most accomplished musicians and dancers. Beyond the basic need for food and drink, the gods needed housing, and only the most luxurious would be suitable. It's like Donald Trump. He's like, I like gold, a lot of gold. I'm sorry, I won't do it no more. The more gold, silver, gems, lapis lazuli, fine wood, carved stonework, and glorious tapestries, the more honor would accrue to the god. The gods, accrue, thank you, the gods. The gods, eventually tired of providing all these for themselves, like any human lord, they expected things to be done for them. So it was in accordance with the entitlement of the gods that humans were created to care for the needs of the gods. So you see the difference there? God provides Adam with everything, but in the ancient world, the gods are making the humans provide for them. I got a couple scriptures, but something for homework. Write down Psalms 50, 10 through 12. 1 Samuel 15, 22. I'm going too fast. Let's say Psalms 51, 16 through 17. Hosea 6, chapter 6, verse 6. Micah chapter 6, 6 through 8. And Isaiah 1, verse 11. I can make a copy for him. I can write them down on the board. Anyways.
Write those down.
I will. Write that down. Make a little note. The reason what's so great about these, we're going to go over them anyways, but I'm gonna just write down two that I think are the most. So you want Psalms
That's a.
50, 10 through 12. And then you can read the whole Psalms, it's great Psalms, but this major part here. First Samuel, and then what these will cover is show you the difference between God and what the other gods are doing. What Yahweh is versus how these are reading. Where these gods need things, these verses are going to tell you Yahweh needs nothing. So, 1 Samuel 15:22. Here, I made my two's better. I'm sorry. I didn't just six verse six. I can't remember how to spell Isaiah. There you go. Look them verses up. Can you see them? I'm sorry. You know, if y'all were in tech, oh, this one right here,
The third one.
this one, Isaiah 6:6. You take a screenshot, picture. That's what millennials would do. They wouldn't write it down. They'd be like,
I don't see any millennials in here.
well, technically, I am still a millennial. Bye. So I'm keeping that.
You're Zen.
Zennial.
You can't say still a millennial because you'll always be millennial.
Yeah, right.
Not like
All
you
right.
can graduate and go to another group.
My brother was Gen Xer, so
I'm baby boomer.
baby, poor baby boomers. Okay, boomer. It's like, yeah. All right, where we leave off at?
Watch your mouth there, little kiddo.
I'm gonna start as the gods, so it's the second paragraph.
And then somebody else is beyond baby boomer, it's just ancient.
No, before baby boomers, what is it? The quiet generation?
Forgotten
Oh,
The forgotten generation? Is it forgotten or? I know my mom was a boomer, and my dad was too old to be a boomer, so he was in the other generation.
sick sunshine on you, Roger.
As the gods were therefore dependent upon the human creatures that they had brought into existence to serve them, it became clear that they would need to ensure the continuing existence of these humans if the gods' needs were to continue to be met. And you see this in their story of Gilgamesh, I believe it's Gilgamesh, where doing the flood, Enlil is the only god that wants to really cause the flood because he's just tired of hearing the humans' noises. Gilgamesh is also punished because he makes a lot of noise. That's just a theme. I don't know why they're making a lot of noise. Where at the end of it, the gods work together to help the humans because they need sacrifices. And so then it says as Nefeshinatu, I'm butchering his name there. He's the Noah of the story. As he offers the offering, the gods are like flies above the offering. Because in that sense, the offerings would be materialized into their dimension, and then they would eat upon it because they're not in our dimension, or they're not in our world in a sense. So the early Sumers thought there's I can't remember the name of the mountain range, but there's a mountain range right there next to and Uruk and all that, that they believe the gods lived on, and as time developed, that's where the ziggurat would represent a mountain. And then as their theology developed, they have this understanding as this divine mountain that goes up into the unseen realm, but it's connected to the earth.
Were there a lot of cigarettes?
Ziggurat. Oh,
No, seriously.
yeah. There's a lot of lucky strikes
No.
and camels. No, I'm just
Was
messing.
there a lot of?
Yes.
other
There's actually multiple ziggurats within a city. The largest ziggurat would usually be the city-state, because they're like a city-state. They would usually be the city's main god. So like in Babylon, during the days of like Nebuchadnezzar, Marduk was the main god. Originally it was Enlil, but Marduk takes the place of Enlil. But they're the same gods, essentially. They do the same thing. They're thunder gods. So his temple is the biggest. It's in Ur, it's a female deity whose temple is the biggest. And I can't remember her name. I think she's the cohort of I think she is. No, it's Anianu. Anianu is the, so in Ur it's a female deity, where in Babylon it's a male deity called Marduk, which is basically Baal, if you understand I will go over the legends. I don't have a problem teaching you the legends because I think it's good to understand what the Jews are fighting against. And you'll find that they're not always bad legends. They make sense in a way if you're living in that world. But at the same time, they do offer children and stuff like that. So it's their offerings more than anything in their rituals. Because you have a lot of overlap, just being honest with you. This is why I can understand why a secular anthropologist or someone like that, they come along and they say, well, it's all developed out of the same culture. Because you do have a lot of overlap. But how I defend the faith and how I look at this is that God's merciful, that we have our form of worship. And maybe there's some original worship there. When Noah comes off the boat, God says, hey, this is how I want to be worshiped. And then as time progressed, we corrupt it. So I think there's some of that. So I think there's I call it my plumb line theory. There's a plumb line of truth through every religion, but not pure truth. And the danger of, half truth is the half of the truth, right? The part that's not true, that takes you away into demons and demonic worlds. So I do think there's something like that. That's why I think there's a lot of similarities, because in the beginning, if God is true, I think if God's true, he's going to tell you how he wants to be worshipped. And since there's no written record at the time, and there could have been a written record, we just could have lost a written record. We know there's a lot of stories that we've lost, but there's a lot of things that we have, right? So things die out all the time in human history because one group kills another group. And so God pulls back, and he doesn't reappear into time, basically, until Abraham. So I would tell you that Abraham and Nimrod are not close together. The Bible makes them close together because it's trying to give you a narrative. It's not trying to date time or do a calendar or nothing like that. That's the problem with counting back in the Torah and saying, okay, the earth is so old. This is my problem with this, because if you look at the other texts, like if you look at the Septuagint versus the Masoretic text versus the Qumran text, there's names missing in the Masoretic text that are in the Septuagint, and there's things missing out of the Septuagint. So you can't just add these names back. And name lists historically weren't used that way. So naming names weren't used to date Earth or to date time in the ancient world. What it was used to show you authority. It's kind of like what we do. We believe in apostolic succession, right? We say our bishop is connected to a bishop who's connected to a bishop and goes all the way back to one of the apostles. So that's what we believe in. Yeah. So we say that. That's the same thing. They're using ancestry apostolic succession, where they're going back, where Abraham's saying, I'm kin to Seth. And Seth was given the blessing, not what's the other guy's name? I can't remember. All their names are something like Abel, Cain. Not Cain. Cain wasn't given the blessing. Seth was given the blessing. And so what most scholars would argue is that what's happening is these lists of names are the ones receiving the blessing. So it's not the whole tribal history there going on. And one of your reference points we can show that probably prove that right would be the genealogy of Jesus Christ. There's more genealogies in Jesus Christ's genes there than what is given in the New Testament. If you don't believe me, just go read your Old Testament. You'll see that. They drop because they want the 14. The 14 is the numeric number they want. So they want you to show you that he is the special generation of the 14 of the 14 of the 14. Boom. Because they're using numbers there to be symbolic. This is probably why Moses is 40. He lives in the desert for 40, comes back for 40. He hangs out for 40. You get a lot of 40s there because it's a symbolic number. I mean, how do you tell time? Water pots? There's one way. Moon. I mean, they had a sundial. I think they discovered that's really pretty decent. But again, they don't have BC. They don't have AD. That's us. We have that. We created that. And we created that by looking at all the events happening and who's talking about who in the paper there, and then we say, okay, all these people seems to be around this, and then we make an artificial zero and we work off that zero. So we go backwards, right? You go 1, 2 to 2000, and you go the opposite way, right? 1 to 2. You got your positive and negatives there, I guess you can say. So that's how we do it. So how they date is off of the 40 year of King so and so. Well, what if that king no longer exists? Tell me about the Hittites. Anybody want to tell me about the Hittites? They're Indo-Europeans. No, me either. You know why we don't know much about them? We know a little bit about them because we have some of the writings, but guess what? We don't know a lot about them. Why? Because most of their stuff got destroyed. So you see what I'm saying? Or about the Hindu Valley River people that lived around the 3000 BC. Do we know anything about them? They had plumbing, hot and cold water. If plumbing got broke, they could remove chunks of clay. They would make these clay cylinders, and they could easily just move one and fix it. And then one day, they just stopped. They just migrated out. We don't know why. We don't find arrowheads. We have no idea. They seem to be a peaceful society because we don't find a lot of weapons. Some of the script that we find, we can't. Yeah, make a buy a gun. But we find them. We don't find a lot of arrowheads. We don't find anything. And some beliefs. Then we find that anybody know the history of the Hindus, India, where the Aryans come out of the Middle East. They start intermingling with the Indian people that are there, and they make the caste system anyways. Then all of a sudden the land is repopulated, and then we find arrowheads and we find weapons because we get the Aryans in there, and then you start seeing the development of like the Brahmin and all the early Hindu belief system developing there. But before that, we have a whole people that believed, that worshiped, that had something, and they just all disappear. And we can't tell you anything about them. Which is sad in a way because I like history. I love this stuff. That's why we can sit and talk about this all day long. And it doesn't have to be biblical. It could be any of the history. I like all the history. But if it wasn't for that history, I wouldn't be believing in the Bible anyway. So I came the opposite way, I guess you can say. That helped with my atheist. Anyways, back to this. Consequently, people were dependent on the provisions and protection of the gods. And the gods, in turn, were dependent on what the people provided for their upkeep. The codependence eventuated, right? I got one right. In the great symbiosis of the ancient world, in which the gods could acquire all the entitlements and could receive what was appropriate to their station. The great symbiosis framed the religious system and practice of the ancient world and was centered in the temple. The ritual meeting of the gods' needs were conscientiously carried out. I swear I read this earlier many a times. Carried out so that the gods would continue dwelling among the people. How many are familiar with your Old Testament? Everybody raises their hands because everybody's familiar with the Old Testament, right? You see this kind of program in the Old Testament where God is there and God leaves, right? The children of Israel start following after other gods. God pulls back. I argue out of mercy. He pulls back away from them. And he leads them to their own vices. And what usually happens when God pulls back? They get defeated. Another tribe comes in and takes them over. Empire comes in and takes them over. A plague. Because in the ancient world, the thought process, you keep the God happy, and then the God protects. Now, Yahweh is different in that sense because he doesn't actually get angry as we think of anger and all that. Most theologians would argue God don't get angry like that. We have language that we use for God as he's getting angry, but that's just from our perspective kind of thing. But God is merciful, so he's unjust. So he's looking for mercy and justice at the same time, and that's a hard thing to provide sometimes. But when the children of Israel gets evil, or they start wandering off of other gods, he pulls back and he allows them to fulfill their own work. He said, I set before you life and death. Choose life. Life is following him and doing all the stuff if you do all the stuff that he says, you have a strong crop. Why do you have a strong crop? Because you actually grew your crop. You're not out warring, and doing all this other stuff. In other words, if the criminal would stay home and not break the law, he wouldn't be in jail. He'd be a happy guy. But his own actions is the reason why he's in jail, right? At least the system will tell you that, right? And so his own actions is the reason why he's in jail. Therefore, he's in jail because of what he did, not for what he didn't do, right? If he just stayed home, he'd be fine, be okay. Nobody would bother him, and he wouldn't bother nobody else. But he wanted, as Immanuel Kant said, he wants an exception to the rule. He wants your stuff, but don't want you to take his stuff. So, anyways, so that's what's happening with the people. It's not necessarily our God is not necessarily that he's mad at you and he's punishing you as much as he's pulling back away from you, and that's the punishment. In other words, Yahweh in your life, then there's no protection. Because in a sense, think about it like two shepherds. You have Satan as a shepherd and you have God as a shepherd. The shepherd is only going to respond to his sheep. So if you're doing the things that Satan wants you to do, and you're heeding to Satan, then God is never going to respond to your calls, because you're not his servant, you're Satan's servant, and he's not going to drag his name into the mud, right? Repentance is where you call for help to Yahweh and you say, I want to change my ways and I want to be in your sheepfold. And he picks you up, puts you in his, and then you bat all day long, and then he comes and shows up because now you're his sheep. But a shepherd won't cross, he won't break the rules, he won't jump the fence to help you if you're praising, worshiping evil. It's just not how it works. And so he's over here in this field, you're over there in that field. He's not going to move and save you. So you're left to your own device. And what did Satan come in the first place? He came to kill, steal, and destroy. So if he came to kill, steal, and destroy, and you're his sheep, that means you have one route. You're going to get butchered. And that's where death comes in, right? Because you obeyed him and his ways are sins. Anyway, the people were diligent in the performance and their ritual responsibility, because in that way they could enjoy divine favor. If the God became angry and this could happen for any number of reasons, whether petty or serious, whether the cause was known and unknown, or even unknowable, stability of the community or the individual would be in jeopardy. In many instances, the king was expected to maintain justice within the community so that the gods could serve, and in turn would bring safety, security, stability, prosperity for the people. This is the religious world of the ancient Near East. In the temples, the gods were pampered. No expense was spared to ensure that the gods would not become angry and strike out at the people and become offended and abandon the people to the demonic forces of their enemies, or worse, all become dissatisfied that they would leave altogether. The gods' presence were essential, and thus the temple became the locus for the divine-human relationship, a fragile and often unpredictable relationship of mutual need and dependence. There's no Torah with the other gods. There's no Torah how to worship and how not to worship. This is how magic develops. This is how spells develops. You need to know the will of the God. How do you know the will of the God? Well, you have to have an incanter. You have to have somebody who's a mystic or something like that. And so what developed out of the system, because there's no rules and laws, you envelop these psychic abilities people. And then they would use some kind of drug-induced vision or something like that, or they would establish bones, where they would throw down the bones, they read the bones, intestinal entrails, they read the intestines or the stuff that comes out the backside of certain animals, and they would read this, and this would then tell them what the gods want and what the gods needed, and then the king would act upon that because he's the one to make sure everything flows. The king is the main guard, and a lot of times one of the main priests he worked within. So a lot of these systems, you had a high priest style where the high priest would do things annually, and then at certain festival times, the king would come in and take on the role as high priest, and then he would perform much of the duties and stuff like that. So any questions on any of this? I'm not trying to get y'all into Akkadian religion. I just want y'all to see the Near East, how this flows. I told you when we started this, I've always done this around biblical study versus a Bible study. The only reason why I do biblical study is I want you to see the world around the Bible. So when you're reading your Bible and you come across a passage, you're no longer confused about what's going on in the passage. You can sit there and say, well, this makes sense. It's logical. It gives you more confidence. Hopefully it gives you more confidence in reading your Bible. Right? What time is it? 9:18. Okay, we got a few minutes. So what's the next one? I think it's the long one. This next one. So I debated on this when we got to this. We get to the ziggurat part at the end. I do the other paper, but I don't know if that was confuse y'all, so I didn't want. So I figured maybe we'd do 2 days. We basically covered both papers I gave you. They covered. I gave y'all 2.
These are
So,
Can I ask you a quick question? about
only a
the
quick
cig-
question,
Okay,
then I
quick
run.
question. The Tower of Babel, that was a ziggurat.
Yes, we're gonna get into
Okay.
that.
Okay.
That's one of the stories I want us to get into.
Is it a book?
You're pass it. No, it's just a chapter out of. So, what we're reading now is is out of a book called the scenes behind the Old Testament, and then the other one I gave you is by Dr. John Walton, which I don't know where my copy is. All right, it's underneath here. So the next one is chapter 5 out of a book called The Near East Thought of the Old Testament by Dr. John Walton. You're gonna actually find Dr. John Walton on YouTube. Just put in his name, Genesis, and he has a bunch of videos. He's kind of doing the Heiser thing. So it's kind of like Heiser to me now that Heiser passed away. And if you want anything Heiser material while buying his material, you just go to if you Google Heiser's name, it'll come up with his little website, and almost everything out of his books is there for free. So, teaching you how to be a good Jew. Welcome to Judaism. I just doesn't know you. Yeah. Everything, let me tell you something. When I became Catholic, I chuckled or Anglican Catholic here, I chuckled because this is an expensive religion. All the vestments and all that. I chuckled because I was like, Judaism is expensive. When I was in Judaism, it's expensive as well. You get a good blessed mezuzah is like $35. You know, menorah is $150. A good trumpet, a good whatever it's called now. Shofar, thank you. Couldn't remember my own words. A good shofar was like $150, $160, you know, when you get the big long ones and everybody wants a long one. Talits, man, a talit can be like $40, $50, up to $100, $200. Depends on, you know, I guess how blessed it is, I don't know. But anyways, I chuckle at that. So I'm just trying to give you how to get around the system here. Got to get around the system. All right, supporting components of personal procedures, images of the ziggurat is the bottom section there. And the first pamphlet still. Anybody lost? If not, I'll help you out.
Page 2.
Yeah, I didn't number this because it's very old, but I numbered a new one, so boom. Well, I didn't want to go back and renumber it after I printed it all. So anyways. Supporting components, personal procedures, images, and ziggurat. In Mesopotamia culture, a variety of supporting components played a role in the successful function of the temple. The rituals were designed to meet the needs of the gods and affirm the greatness of the gods by giving gifts. Worship consisted of rituals, and they took place in the temple to assure the gods' comfort and favor. The priests were appointed guardians of sacred space, making sure the system was working the way it should. I want to show you. So the average ziggurats can actually get very fancy, so there could be multiple ziggurats. Basically, the simplest ziggurat, would just be a triangle like that. We'd have stairs coming down it, like here, and off to the side, you would have the temple. At the top, you would have a room, and usually, here, we'll come down from the top view of the room. In the room, you usually would have some kind of table and then some kind of bed here. And bed was an item of luxury in the past because usually you slept on the floor. So nobody went up here but the priest. They would go there and set him some food every once in a while. All worship happened here. There would be an idol here inside the actual temple. Here, I just got a little guy there. I don't know what the world it is. There'd be a guy here, and they would do a procedure which we're going to study later on, so I'm waiting on that. And they would worship here. So all the worshiping would happen here. So, and then they would once a while through prayers and enchantment and enticement. So you're trying to entice the god they would go up here and they would lay out food. So if the ceremonies worked out right, the spirit or the presence of the deity would take a home in this item here, this idol. And then all communication to the idol to the god would be through the idol. And then through ceremonials, once in a while, they would take the idol back up here. The point is you're trying to force or or trick, or you don't care how you get to God. You're trying to get to God into the temple so that He's worshiping with you. You see what's going on here? Now think of Tower of Babel. That's what they're doing in the Tower of Babel. Right? They're doing this procedure. Now, ziggurats could be really fancy, so fancy, like, Southern fancy, plantation fancy, you know what I'm talking about? So they could have, multiple stages, and a lot of them would look like this, and then a lot of times the home would be here, and then you would have a set of stairs coming down. I'm trying to save some of the stuff for when we get more into the ziggurat, but it look like this, where you would have your priest, and then there would be like elaborate courts and stuff like that, gardens, water, all that would be around it, which we're going to get into. So, what did I leave off? I'm going to start with the priest. The priest was appointed guardians of sacred space, making sure the system was working the way it should. Proper offerings needed to be brought at the proper times and offered in proper ways. The ritual status of the person bringing the offering must be ascertained. Sacred times, whether for daily offerings or annual festivals, all had to be observed, and this was the duty of the priest. It was a dangerous role because they could most easily be the ones responsible of offending the gods. See why now Lot is willing to give up his daughters because he doesn't want to offend the God. And we don't even know if Lot is a believer like Abraham. Lot's family is not really, they're not really great believers. They don't seem like. Right? Later on, Laban, Rebecca's brother, worships Canaanite God. So we don't know if Abraham's the only one, mainly in his family, worshiping, or people are just worshiping because he's the elder, and a lot of times that would happen because he's the main chief, and you would do whatever your main chief does. We know there's probably, more likely there is a little bit of mixing, though, to be honest with you, where some of these early patriarchs are still loosely in the same world as the other pagans around them. And you see this with Rachel when she steals the family gods from Laban, and she hides them. And then she tells, when they're looking for him, she tells them she can't get off the camel and all that. So you see that is still happening, right? So it was also the role that had great significance in the community because these specialists were responsible for making sure the needs of the gods were supplied and that the gods were thereby kept content. All the rituals conducted in the temple were dependent on the established presence of the god, represented by the image of the deity. Without the image, there was no assurance that the deity was present, in which case the temple was of none consequence. Rituals developed over time that were designed to acquire the deity's blessing on the manufacture of an image so that the image might be deemed a suitable, respectable for the essence of the deity. The image then became the focal point for the care given to the deity. Food, drink were offered before the image. Beautiful clothing was provided. Offering for divinations were presented in the presence of the divine guidance and as deemed appropriate. The image was carried forth from processions for major festivals. If the inner sanctum of the temple was the most sacred space associated with the temple, the ziggurat arguably ranked only a little lower. Ziggurats were positioned next to the temple. So this is the temple, this is the ziggurat, this is the temple, this is the ziggurat. Just so you know, the temple is not the ziggurat. The ziggurats were positioned next to the temples and were intended to provide a convenience for the gods as they descended to the temples to be worshipped one of many ways to entice a deity to take up residence among the people. The ziggurat had names that designated them sacred space and that they can at times give us a sense of their cosmic role. Sacred space that links heaven to earth, these are names now. Sacred foundation of the earth, and later on we'll read the other one, you'll see that the sacred ladder of heaven, which is kind of like Jacob's dream when he's at Bethel, a sacred space. Bethel later becomes a sacred area of the Jews. The significance of the ziggurat is to be found in the ramps or stairways that are the most prominent physical feature in the shrine. The grace that peak of the structure, or the Ginnu. The Ginnu was not the temple adjoining the ziggurat. It is the house. It does not house the image. So it's the top. Like I said earlier, the image is down here in the temple. The top is not the temple. It's called the Ginnu. Oh my God, it's kind of like something off of Dragon Ball Z, the Gingu Force. Any Dragon Ball Z fans? No? Yeah, there you go. So you know the dance. The Ginnu is not like the temple adjoining the ziggurat. It does not house the image of the deity. Furthermore, it appears that the sacrificial rituals did not take place there, though at times food gifts were provided for the deity. The Ginnu provides the god's living quarters, distinguished from the throne in the temple itself. Compare the distinction in the American White House, where there is a private residential quarters for the president and his family, as well as the Oval Office, in which business is conducted. A bed was maintained in the Gingu, in addition with a table where food was supplied, and vessels were for bathing and anointing the statue. Perhaps the image of the deity would be brought there when it was not at work in the temple. There the gods could be bathed and refreshed while off duty. Given all this information, it is clear that the ziggurat was generally off limits to people. This was the property of the gods and provided divine prerogatives and sacred privacy. I think we have to stop there.
So the ziggurats, was at the time, before the time of the Hebrew God, correct?
Well, no, the Hebrew God always existed. He's like, I'm so great, I've been around forever.
I know, but before, how do I say this?
Yes. If you were looking at it from a secular point of view, yes. You're looking at, so Abraham doesn't exist until about 2000 BC.
Okay, yeah.
You're talking about 3500 BC, 4000 BC, and if your secular date, ziggurats date back to like 7000
Because
BC.
it was never the image of the Hebrew God.
Right,
Okay.
right. So what we're doing is just comparing and contrasting. We're looking at how everybody else saw sacred space, and then we're going to look at the Bible. So I'm taking you to the Bible. I just want you to see the culture around it. What are the Jews fighting for? What are they arguing for? What is going on in your Old Testament? Why is all this important? You see what I'm saying? And in many ways, it's just like now. Think about now. Everything, all the things that are deemed sacred, that if you cross now, there's all kinds of things. There's names that you can't mention on the internet.